Within the administrative and domestic structures of the Ottoman Empire, the Imperial Harem functioned not merely as a private household, but as a regulated institution embedded within the broader mechanisms of governance. Historical records indicate that the harem was governed by strict hierarchies, codified expectations, and disciplinary systems that reflected both palace protocol and imperial authority. Far from the romanticized portrayals often associated with it, the harem operated under a framework where order, obedience, and loyalty were essential to maintaining stability within the ruling household. At the center of this system stood the reigning sultan, whose authority extended into all aspects of palace life. However, daily governance of the harem was largely delegated. Contemporary accounts describe the prominent role of the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, who exercised significant administrative control over the women of the harem. Beneath her, the hierarchy extended through senior consorts, favored concubines, and a large number of enslaved women, each occupying a defined rank. The enforcement of discipline was primarily managed through this internal structure, with oversight from court officials and eunuchs assigned to the palace. Surviving documents suggest that concubines were subject to a highly regulated routine. Their training included education in court etiquette, language, music, and religious instruction, particularly within the framework of Islam, which underpinned much of Ottoman legal and social life. Compliance with these expectations was not optional. Legal codes of the period reveal that discipline within the palace was considered a matter of both moral and administrative concern. The punishment system directed at concubines must be understood within this broader context of regulation and control. Contrary to later sensational narratives, most disciplinary measures were bureaucratic and procedural rather than arbitrary acts of violence. Chroniclers noted that minor infractions, such as breaches of etiquette, insubordination, or failure to perform assigned duties, were typically addressed through graduated penalties. These could include verbal reprimands, temporary isolation, or reassignment to lower-status duties within the harem. More serious violations, however, triggered more consequential responses. Historical records indicate that concubines who disrupted the internal order of the harem, engaged in prohibited relationships, or violated expectations of loyalty could face removal from positions of favor. In a system where advancement depended on proximity to power, such demotions carried significant long-term consequences. Loss of status meant reduced access to resources, diminished prospects for influence, and in some cases, permanent marginalization within the palace hierarchy. In certain cases, punishment extended beyond internal demotion. Surviving administrative records suggest that concubines could be transferred out of the imperial palace entirely. This practice functioned as both a disciplinary measure and a means of maintaining order. Women removed from the harem might be reassigned to provincial households, married off to officials, or placed into other forms of service within the empire. While this did not necessarily constitute formal exile, it effectively removed individuals from the center of imperial power. The role of the eunuchs, particularly the chief black eunuch, was central to the enforcement of discipline. Contemporary accounts describe their responsibilities as extending beyond security into the management of daily operations within the harem. They acted as intermediaries between the women and the outer court, ensuring that rules were followed and reporting violations to higher authorities. Their position within the palace hierarchy allowed them to influence both the application and severity of disciplinary measures. Legal frameworks within the empire also shaped the boundaries of punishment. The Ottoman legal system, which combined elements of Islamic jurisprudence and imperial decree, placed limits on certain forms of punishment, particularly within the palace environment. While physical punishment was not entirely absent, historical evidence suggests that it was regulated and often secondary to administrative penalties. The emphasis remained on maintaining order rather than inflicting harm. Chroniclers noted that the internal dynamics of the harem often influenced how discipline was applied. Rivalries between concubines, competition for favor, and shifting alliances could affect outcomes. Accusations of misconduct were sometimes intertwined with political maneuvering, as women sought to advance their positions within the hierarchy. In this environment, punishment could serve both as a response to genuine infractions and as a tool within broader struggles for influence. The presence of favored consorts introduced additional complexity. Women who had borne children for the sultan, particularly sons, occupied elevated positions within the harem. Their status provided a degree of protection, although not absolute immunity. Historical records indicate that even high-ranking women could face consequences if their actions threatened the stability of the palace or the legitimacy of succession. However, the form of punishment in such cases often differed, emphasizing negotiation and containment rather than overt disciplinary measures. Surviving documents suggest that the ultimate concern of the imperial administration was the preservation of order within the palace. The harem was not isolated from the political realities of the empire. Rather, it was deeply connected to questions of succession, legitimacy, and governance. Any disruption within this environment had the potential to affect the broader stability of the state. As a result, the punishment system functioned as a mechanism for preventing instability before it could escalate. In rare instances, more severe actions were taken. Some historical accounts reference cases where individuals were subjected to confinement under stricter conditions or permanently removed from palace life under guarded circumstances. These measures were typically reserved for situations perceived as significant threats to order or security. However, such cases appear limited in the surviving record and are often described in cautious, indirect terms by contemporary chroniclers. The administrative nature of the harem's disciplinary system reflects the broader characteristics of Ottoman governance. The empire relied on structured hierarchies, clearly defined roles, and systems of accountability. Within this framework, punishment was not merely a reaction to misconduct, but an integral component of maintaining institutional stability. The regulation of behavior within the harem mirrored the governance strategies applied throughout the empire, where order was preserved through a combination of oversight, hierarchy, and controlled enforcement. Over time, these systems evolved in response to changes within the empire. Shifts in political power, administrative reforms, and external pressures influenced how the harem operated and how discipline was enforced. Nevertheless, the underlying principles remained consistent. Historical records indicate that the emphasis on order, hierarchy, and controlled authority continued to shape the lived realities of those within the imperial household. The experiences of concubines within this system were therefore defined not only by their individual circumstances, but by the institutional structures that governed their lives. Their position within the hierarchy determined both their opportunities and their vulnerabilities. Punishment, in this context, functioned less as an instrument of arbitrary control and more as a regulated process embedded within the administrative logic of the palace. As contemporary scholarship continues to examine archival materials and reassess earlier interpretations, a more nuanced understanding of the imperial harem has emerged. Rather than viewing it solely through the lens of confinement or excess, historians increasingly interpret it as a complex institution where power, discipline, and governance intersected. Within this environment, the systems used to regulate concubines reveal broader insights into the nature of authority within the Ottoman state and the methods by which it sought to preserve order at the very center of its rule. Within this regulated environment, the application of punishment cannot be separated from the mechanisms through which the imperial household reproduced authority and ensured continuity. Historical records indicate that discipline within the harem was closely tied to the management of reputation, discretion, and the preservation of internal secrecy. The palace functioned as both a domestic space and a political institution, and the conduct of concubines was therefore evaluated not only in personal terms, but in relation to its potential impact on imperial stability. Contemporary accounts describe how surveillance operated as a constant presence within the harem. Eunuchs, senior attendants, and appointed supervisors maintained oversight of daily routines, movements, and interactions. This system did not rely solely on physical enforcement. It also depended on the expectation that behavior would be observed, recorded, and reported. Surviving documents suggest that this environment fostered a form of internal regulation, in which concubines adjusted their conduct in anticipation of scrutiny. Punishment, in this context, functioned as both a corrective measure and a deterrent. Chroniclers noted that communication within the harem was carefully controlled. Unauthorized contact with individuals outside the prescribed hierarchy, particularly with men beyond the sanctioned structure, was treated as a serious violation. Legal codes of the period reveal that such actions were interpreted not only as breaches of etiquette, but as potential threats to dynastic legitimacy. The reproductive role of the harem, especially in relation to succession, made questions of loyalty and exclusivity central to its governance. As a result, accusations involving illicit relationships were among the most consequential forms of misconduct. When such allegations arose, the response was typically investigative rather than immediate. Historical records indicate that inquiries were conducted through internal channels, often involving testimony from attendants and supervisors. The outcome of these investigations could vary, depending on the status of the individuals involved and the perceived credibility of the evidence. In some cases, uncertainty itself could lead to precautionary measures, reflecting the priority placed on maintaining order over resolving ambiguity. The consequences of confirmed violations could extend beyond demotion or reassignment. Surviving documents suggest that concubines found to have engaged in prohibited relationships were often removed from the palace under controlled conditions. This removal served multiple purposes. It eliminated the immediate source of disruption, reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and signaled the consequences of transgression to others within the hierarchy. While such actions were framed as administrative decisions, their impact on the individuals involved was substantial, effectively ending their participation in the central structures of power. The emphasis on discretion also shaped the way punishment was carried out. Contemporary accounts describe a preference for minimizing public visibility, even within the enclosed world of the harem. Discipline was often administered in a manner that avoided overt spectacle, reinforcing the perception of order and control. This approach aligned with broader Ottoman administrative practices, where the appearance of stability was considered essential to the legitimacy of authority. In addition to formal disciplinary measures, informal mechanisms of control played a significant role. Chroniclers noted that social dynamics within the harem could act as a form of enforcement. Favor, access, and opportunity were distributed unevenly, and the withdrawal of these could serve as a powerful incentive for compliance. Concubines who fell out of favor might find themselves excluded from key activities, denied opportunities for advancement, or reassigned to roles with limited visibility. These outcomes, while not always recorded as formal punishments, functioned within the same system of regulation. The influence of the Valide Sultan remained central in determining how discipline was applied. Historical records indicate that her authority extended to the arbitration of disputes, the evaluation of conduct, and the final approval of significant decisions affecting the women of the harem. Her position allowed her to balance competing interests, including the maintenance of order, the management of rivalries, and the protection of the dynasty's reputation. In this role, punishment could become a tool of governance, used to shape behavior and reinforce hierarchy. The relationship between discipline and advancement further illustrates the structured nature of the system. Surviving documents suggest that compliance with expectations could lead to increased status, improved living conditions, and greater proximity to the sultan. Conversely, misconduct could halt or reverse this progression. This dynamic created a continuous process of evaluation, in which concubines navigated both opportunity and risk. Punishment, therefore, was not an isolated event, but part of an ongoing system of incentives and constraints. In examining the broader legal context, the integration of Islam into Ottoman governance provided an additional framework for understanding discipline. Legal scholars of the period addressed issues of morality, conduct, and authority within both public and private domains. While the harem operated under specific palace regulations, these were informed by wider legal and ethical principles. The enforcement of discipline within the harem thus reflected a combination of institutional policy and religiously influenced norms. Chroniclers also noted the importance of maintaining the hierarchy among the women themselves. Conflicts between concubines, particularly those competing for influence or recognition, were a recurring feature of harem life. When such disputes escalated, they could disrupt the internal order and require intervention. Historical records indicate that punishment in these cases often aimed to restore balance rather than assign blame in absolute terms. Reassignments, separations, or adjustments in status were used to manage tensions and prevent further conflict. The presence of younger or newly arrived concubines introduced additional layers to the disciplinary system. These individuals underwent a period of training and evaluation, during which their behavior was closely monitored. Surviving documents suggest that early infractions were often addressed with corrective measures designed to reinforce expectations. However, repeated or serious violations could result in removal before the individual became fully integrated into the hierarchy. This process functioned as a form of institutional filtering, ensuring that only those who adapted to the system remained within it. The broader political environment of the Ottoman Empire also influenced how discipline was perceived and applied. Periods of instability, succession disputes, or administrative reform could heighten sensitivity to potential disruptions within the palace. In such contexts, the threshold for punitive action may have shifted, reflecting the increased importance of maintaining internal cohesion. Conversely, during more stable periods, there is evidence to suggest that discipline could be applied with greater flexibility, allowing for negotiation and adjustment. Surviving archival materials indicate that the consequences of punishment extended beyond the immediate moment. The reassignment or removal of a concubine could alter the balance of influence within the harem, affecting alliances, rivalries, and the distribution of resources. In this way, disciplinary decisions had ripple effects that shaped the internal dynamics of the palace over time. The management of these effects required careful consideration, further emphasizing the administrative nature of the system. The structured approach to punishment also reflected the broader Ottoman emphasis on continuity. The imperial household was expected to function as a stable institution across generations, and its internal systems were designed with this objective in mind. Discipline, therefore, was not only about addressing individual behavior, but about preserving the long-term integrity of the institution. Historical records consistently highlight this focus on continuity, suggesting that the regulation of the harem was viewed as integral to the endurance of imperial authority. As research into palace archives and administrative records continues, historians have gained a clearer understanding of how these systems operated in practice. The image that emerges is one of a highly organized institution, where discipline was embedded within a network of roles, expectations, and procedures. The experiences of concubines within this system were shaped by these structures, which defined both the possibilities available to them and the consequences of failing to conform. This evolving interpretation challenges earlier narratives that emphasized unpredictability or excess. Instead, it points to a model of governance in which control was exercised through consistent, regulated means. Within the harem, punishment functioned as a component of this broader system, reinforcing the hierarchies and norms that sustained the imperial household. Over time, the disciplinary structures within the imperial harem did not remain static. Historical records indicate that they evolved alongside broader transformations in the administrative and political architecture of the Ottoman Empire. As the empire entered periods of reform and centralization, particularly from the late 18th century onward, the mechanisms governing palace life increasingly reflected wider state efforts to standardize authority and reduce informal power networks. Surviving administrative correspondence suggests that by this period, greater emphasis was placed on documentation and procedural consistency. Disciplinary actions within the harem were more frequently recorded, categorized, and integrated into formal reporting structures. This shift did not fundamentally alter the hierarchical nature of the institution, but it did change how punishment was justified and administered. Decisions that may once have been executed primarily through internal discretion increasingly required alignment with broader palace protocols. Chroniclers and court observers noted that the role of the eunuch administration remained central even as reforms advanced. The chief black eunuch continued to function as a key intermediary between the imperial household and the outer administrative apparatus. His responsibilities included overseeing discipline, transmitting orders, and ensuring compliance with palace regulations. However, historical evidence suggests that his authority became more bureaucratically defined over time, reflecting the empire's gradual move toward formalized governance structures. Within this evolving system, punishment retained its core function as a mechanism of order maintenance, but its expression became more regulated. Physical coercion, where it occurred, appears in surviving records less frequently than administrative sanctions such as confinement within designated areas of the palace, reassignment to lower status service, or removal from court proximity. Contemporary accounts emphasize that the management of reputation and status remained central, with exclusion from influence often constituting the most significant form of disciplinary consequence. The increasing complexity of palace bureaucracy also meant that disciplinary outcomes were more tightly linked to institutional stability. Historical records indicate that concubines who had attained higher status, particularly those associated with the birth of potential heirs, were subject to more carefully calibrated forms of regulation. Direct punitive action in such cases risked destabilizing succession dynamics, and therefore responses were often framed in terms of containment, negotiation, or controlled isolation rather than overt punishment. At the same time, the symbolic dimension of discipline within the harem became more pronounced. The maintenance of hierarchy was not only a practical necessity, but also a representation of imperial order. Chroniclers noted that visible stability within the palace was closely associated with perceptions of legitimate rule. As a result, disciplinary systems were designed to minimize disruption while reinforcing the appearance of continuity and control. The integration of legal and ethical frameworks derived from Islam continued to inform how behavior was evaluated. However, by the later imperial period, these frameworks were increasingly mediated through state bureaucracy rather than purely religious jurisprudence. Legal scholars and court officials contributed to shaping norms, but their application was filtered through administrative priorities. This contributed to a system in which punishment was less a spontaneous moral response and more a structured administrative tool. As modernization efforts intensified during the 19th century, particularly under reformist administrations, the boundaries between private palace governance and state oversight became more defined. Surviving documents suggest that attempts were made to align palace discipline with broader principles of state reform, including rationalization of authority and reduction of arbitrary decision-making. While the harem remained an enclosed institution, it was not insulated from these shifts. Instead, it adapted in ways that reflected the changing nature of imperial governance. The impact of these reforms on concubines within the harem was gradual but significant. Historical records indicate that pathways of advancement and removal became more systematized, with clearer expectations governing conduct and consequence. This did not eliminate the hierarchical structure, but it introduced greater predictability into disciplinary outcomes. Punishment, in this context, increasingly functioned as part of a regulated career-like system within the palace, rather than as an unpredictable expression of favor or disfavor. The role of the Valide Sultan, while still important, also evolved within this framework. Her influence remained substantial, particularly in matters of internal arbitration and hierarchical management, but it was increasingly balanced by procedural norms. Decisions affecting discipline were more likely to be situated within a network of advisory input from senior officials, reflecting the broader trend toward distributed administrative authority. Chroniclers and later historical analyses suggest that these changes also affected the internal dynamics among concubines. Competition for favor continued to shape behavior, but the mechanisms through which outcomes were determined became more structured. Advancement depended not only on proximity to power, but also on adherence to established expectations. Similarly, disciplinary consequences were more consistently aligned with documented infractions, reducing some of the variability that characterized earlier periods. Despite these changes, the fundamental logic of the system remained intact. The harem continued to function as a controlled environment designed to support the political and dynastic needs of the empire. Within this context, punishment retained its role as a stabilizing force. It regulated behavior, reinforced hierarchy, and ensured that the internal dynamics of the palace did not disrupt broader imperial governance.